Hello, I'm James Quant. Why, after the immense international success of Tejigahara's Woman in the Dunes, was his next film, The Face of Another, his third collaboration with novelist Kobo Abe and composer Toru Takemitsu, largely critically rejected and unsuccessful outside of Japan? The Abe novel in which it was based, and the film itself, extend the themes of Woman in the Dunes, the tenuousness of identity, the existential dilemma of the individual versus community, the nature of freedom and societal constraint. While a considerable success at home, here The Face of Another was dismissed. The film was accused of being extravagantly chic, arch, abstruse, hermetic, slavishly symbolic, more grotesque than emotionally compelling, and generally judged a great letdown after Woman in the Dunes. Any artist is burdened by such an epoch-making success as Woman in the Dunes. They're set up for disappointment, no matter how good their subsequent work is. I've been told that Chantal Akerman, for instance, has felt forever encumbered with the success of her legendary Jeanne Dielman, that every film she made after that existed in Dielman's shadow. So I think it was for Woman in the Dunes and all the Tejigahara films that followed. As well, The Face of Another was Tejigahara's first contemporary urban feature. Pitfall and Woman in the Dunes had isolated exotic settings, and one can't help but wonder if there wasn't a kind of neo-Orientalist reaction against Tejigahara for abandoning those alien and timeless landscapes, which were seen somehow as authentically Japanese, for a world disappointingly familiar in its international urban character. Tejigahara has said that the sandpit in Woman in the Dunes could be found anywhere in the world, New York or San Francisco, but the city in Face of Another seemed much more internationally homogeneous, frustratingly so for those looking for Japaneseness in the films from that country. More generally, I think Face of Another was caught in a recoil from cinematic modernism that proceeded from Pauline Kael's oft-quoted essay, Come Dressed as the Sick Soul of Europe, and gained force during the 60s, as art house giants such as Bergman, Antonioni, and René, directors whom Tejigahara revered and who clearly influenced The Face of Another, were increasingly derided. Such films as Alain René's masterpiece, Je t'aime, with which Face of Another shares many qualities, were victims of this backlash. The critical neglect of The Face of Another endures, even as its themes become more relevant with each news story about face transplants, each debate over the veil. Dori Ashton accords less than a page to the film in her study of the director, and it's treated only glancingly in most studies of Japanese cinema. So I hope that between my essay and the accompanying booklet and this brief talk that I can offer some redress. The film opens with a doubling and redoubling and redoubling of a set of anonymous photographs that look less like portraits than old mugshots, the kind of masked, ambiguous photographs that French artist Christian Boltanski uses in his art about the Holocaust, crime victims, etc. The unidentified multitudes we then see in the darkened street seem almost to sway to Toru Takemitsu's waltz in the film's credit sequence, and they return in one of the film's many repetitions near the end of the film as an eerily masked mob, the everyday faceless group against whom the protagonists in many of Kobo Abe's novels feel exiled, alienated. In Abe's novels, which were influenced by Kafka, the French existentialists, and Russian literature, identity and memory are unfixed, in flux. The Face of Another takes this theme to its extreme, in the tale of a man whose face has been disfigured in an industrial accident, and decides to have a new face fashioned for himself. A disguise that allows him the freedom to take on a new identity, to flout or refuse the roles assigned him by his job, his marriage, and social standing, and to seduce his wife in his guise as another man. He is, as the novel has it, cuckolded by his own self. For those dedicated enough to both read my accompanying notes and listen to this commentary, please forgive any overlap, but I think it's imperative to explore the film's pattern of doubling and repetition, to reveal how Tejigahara finds a visual correlative in Kobo Abe's novel for the duplicate being, the divided self of the book's protagonist, Okayama. Also, how the film fits with Pitfall, as two flanking panels of a triptych, with Woman in the Dunes as the central panel. As different as it is in setting and tone, The Face of Another looks back to Pitfall. It too mixes many genres, has themes of doppelgangers and rebirth, and its structure is based on many foreshadowings, doublings, mirrored images, and sequential echoes, a narrative approach that is employed to the point of exaggeration in The Face of Another. To be literal about it, how best to represent Okayama's double existence, as both his old self and the man with the new face, but through a series of visual parallels and narrative repetitions and rhymes. The replay with variations of Okayama's renting the apartment and his encounter with the yo-yo-obsessed daughter of the superintendent is the most obvious example of this doubling. But everywhere in Face of Another one finds echoed, reiterated, or duplicated items and events that embody the central theme of Okayama's binary self. For example, the Viennese waltz over the credits, and the German song, itself called Waltz, delivered in the München Beer Hall, both written by Toru Takemitsu. The two apartments Okayama rents, one for his bandaged self, one for his face of another. The young scarred woman being sexually accosted by an old soldier in the psychiatric hospital, and Okayama's flailing attempt to assault a woman at the end of the film. The close-up of Machiko Kyo's hobby, gem polishing, and the close-up of the woman's metal handiwork. The backlighting going to darkness, as Okayama and the psychiatrist discuss morality in the München Beer Hall, and the backlighting suddenly dimming as Okayama later moves in to murder him. The multiple ears in the painting in the clinic, which return as a big severed ear in which another patient sits. The earworks were done by sculptor Tomio Miki, whose art quite obsessively focuses on that orifice. He also did the acrylic walls when the architect Isozaki had to be out of Japan for a time. More doubles. The harshly lit wall of lockers near the beginning of the film, and the overlit hallway through which Okayama pursues his wife near the end. The proliferating sea of faces under the film's credits, and the mass of featureless people that suddenly spills out onto the street, impeding Okayama's way. The psychiatrist's eerie clinic with its graphic partitions and blank walls, contrasted with Okayama's home, with its Tokyo modern mélange of pom-pom ball curtains and traditional Japanese dolls. Both spaces are arenas of marital infidelity, the first one actual, the second one merely planned. There's also a marked visual repetition of vertical curtains, the strips through which we first see the woman and her brother at work, the vertical blinds in the boss's office, the partition of vertical strips in Okayama's apartment through which we can see a fireplace, and those perplexing vertical strips of material which are revealed by a zoom out in the sequence of Okayama spying on his wife, another instance of voyeurism in Tejigahara. The psychiatrist clinic has to be one of the most amazing visual conceptions in 60s Japanese cinema, as wild in its way as the saloons in Seijun Suzuki's Tokyo Drifter. The clinic is a Baroque conceit, often credited to art director Masao Yamazaki, but actually designed by Tejigahara's friend, the architect Arata Isozaki, who would later become known for such buildings as the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles and the Olympic Stadium in Barcelona. Like Kobo Abe, Tejigahara, and Toru Takemitsu, Isozaki was determined to combine both Eastern influences, such as the concept of yin and yang, with Western concepts in his art, and I think it's revealing what he says about his early ideas about his vocation. Quote, "For the first 20 years of my career as a professional architect, I believed that architecture could only be accomplished by irony. It could allude to treason. It made it possible to create architecture as criticism. It could admire the vulgar against the noble, the secular against the sacred without shame. It was an unfulfilled wish, a mourning for what was lost. Hiroshima, Holocaust, to bridge over the gap. A style of wit, a sense of humor, and paradox were adopted. End quote. Isozaki's invocation of the Second World War, and particularly of Hiroshima, relates directly to Face of Another and its secondary tale of the woman with radiation scarring from the nuclear bombing at Nagasaki. But his emphasis on paradox and irony is apropos regarding the doctor's clinic, which, as ominous as it is, has a kind of cold, sarcastic wit about its conception. It's a space of flux, of unfixed perspectives, ever-changing furniture, infinitely shifting in its lighting and layout. In itself, a metaphor for the very malleability of identity, the transmutability of flesh, which the doctor traffics in. Speaking of reflections, there's that vertiginous shot in which the nurse approaches the camera, and we suddenly realize when she turns that we've been looking at a mirror image. Soon after, there's that elaborately composed shot of the doctor, which also doubles his image. Isozaki's mannered design of the clinic looks forward to Teji Gahara's celebrated documentary about the Catalan architect Antonio Gaudi. Isozaki also admired Gaudi, and the extravagance of his work here might have been inspired by Gaudi's tendency to the ornate and the overmuch. In turn, the clinic may have influenced the design of Dr. Sartorius's briefly glimpsed office, with its proliferation of glass modules in Tarkovsky's Solaris. For Teji Gahara was one of the few directors Tarkovsky placed amongst the great, along with Bresson and Mizoguchi. And the Russian master's treatment of water and undulating seaweed in Solaris owes something to Teji Gahara's Nihonga abstraction of nature. Teji Gahara and Isozaki were inspired, I would guess, and it's just a hunch, by the proliferation of glass and reflective imagery in Kobo Abe's novels. Abe's characters, severed or estranged from themselves, self-exiled, as is Okuyama in The Face of Another, encounter the reflected images as reminders that they still exist, as unmoored or alienated in the world as they feel. And they're often startled or don't like what they see in the glass, which is truly the case with Okuyama, who goes to the extraordinary length of buying a stranger's face to replace his own. Of course, mirror imagery was also prevalent in the work of Cocteau, very much an influence on Teji Gahara, as we've seen in Pitfall. Teji Gahara employs all manner of shots and visual tricks to magnify the unstable, cruel nature of the clinic. A sudden zoom out reveals Leonardo da Vinci's iconic anatomy diagrams, an insertion of Renaissance humanism as ironic counterpoint to the grim experiment being undertaken by the doctor. The elaborate play of rack focusing in the sequence in which first the doctor and then Okuyama are visually aligned with the charts of Langer's lines, the back and forth suggesting a kind of philosophical duel, updates the Leonardo diagrams and hints at violence, Langer lines being connected to incision, wounds, punctures in the flesh. Toru Takemitsu's eerie use of glass harmonica in the film's music score amplifies the sense of lurking cruelty. At times it seems as if the clinic, a glass cage or theater of cruelty, was designed to frame the face of Kyoko Kishida, the woman in the dunes, now returned as a nurse. Kishida, with those large expressive eyes and puffy lips, not only exuded earthiness or carnality, she had a patina of perversity, at times the voice of conscience, at others an adulteress, and at the end, as she washes her hands, hair unpinned, in the now ultra-mannerist clinic, constellated with black objects and splotches, she has been incorporated into the design as something like an objet d'art. She and the doctor, who joins a long line of dubious or evil physicians in world cinema, are almost entirely invented for the film. The doctor barely exists in the Kobo Abe novel. Here the doctor plays many roles: foil, nemesis, goad, creator, and philosophical double to Okuyama. The two are often positioned in the frame as visual complements to suggest correspondence and complicity. Teji Gahara himself told Joan Mellon, "The doctor is but another part of Okuyama." Indeed, Okuyama's death lunge is something akin to a tender embrace, all the more shocking for the way the doctor simply slides out of the frame, seemingly dying as much of surprise as from the knife shoved into him. The clinic is unquestionably the most daringly designed space in the film, but everywhere in The Face of Another there's keen attention to design, pattern, texture, and composition. For instance, the stippled glass of the apartment superintendent's office, juxtaposed with the herringbone tweed of Okayama's coat, or the tendril pattern on Machiko Kyo's chic little jacket, playing off against the stacked urn patterns on the curtains in her apartment. The inverted V of the staircase shot, and another triangle, slightly skewed this time, as Okayama's bandaged head looms into a triangulated image of 3 construction sites, appropriately enough in the sequence in which he and the doctor are buying his new face to reconstruct his identity. Tejigahara's fondness for shots of feet carries over from Pitfall and Woman in the Dunes, as does the voyeurism motif from Pitfall. The two combined, for instance, in the sequence in which Okayama spies on his wife through the keyhole, which begins with shots of his sneaking feet. Whether it was a matter of taste or economics, Tejigahara stayed faithful to the outmoded combination of black and white stock and full-frame aspect ratio in all 3 films in this set. I should also note that all 3 were shot by Hiroshi Sagawa. I find an aesthetic tension between the old-fashioned or strangely outmoded aspect ratio, a squarish ratio which few cinemas now are even equipped to project, and Tejigahara's arsenal of visual innovation in the film. Freeze frames, defamiliarizing close-ups, wild zooms, wash-away wipes, X-rayed imagery, theatrical lighting, documentary-like street shooting, stuttered editing, letterboxed images, surrealistic tropes and impressionistic imagery, rack focusing, swish pans, jump cuts, rear projection, montage stills in the manner of Chris Marker's La Jetée, edge framing, tilted, fragmented, and otherwise stylized compositions. I think this tension between the classical aspect ratio and the radical nature of both the film's narrative structure and visual design reflects a general tension in Tejigahara's art, which extended beyond filmmaking to calligraphy, ceramics, painting, bamboo installation, opera, and ikebana or flower arranging. His flower arrangements and bamboo installations were radical transformation of traditional forms, much as he maintains in Face of Another the classical form of black and white and full frame, but then fills it with all manner of modernist techniques. Toru Takemitsu's music for the film, especially that sinister waltz, reflects the same tension between East and West, tradition and modernism. Watch for Takemitsu, by the way, the sequence set in the München beer hall. He can be glimpsed amongst the revelers just behind the doctor's head. Nagisa Oshima reportedly said that he looked like the French actor Jean-Louis Barrault with diarrhea. That very peculiar beer hall seems to me more than an instance of cultural dislocation, mirroring Okayama's own dislocation, and certainly more than an example of popular culture turning history into kitsch. It actually existed in the Shinbashi district of Tokyo until about 3 years ago when it made way for an Irish pub. In the Kobo Abe novel, Okayama does go to a beer hall, but it's not identified. In the film, its name, München, and military-looking insignia are emphasized, first in an insert shot of a banner, and then on the beer steins, held by Nakadai so that the logo can clearly be seen, almost in the manner of product placement. So it takes on some importance. Perhaps it's overly literal for me to note that Hitler's rise to power began in a Munich beer hall, but certainly there is a marked war anxiety in the film, which is hardly evident at all in the Kobo Abe novel. For instance, the brief, unsettling sequence just before the beer hall one, in which Eri and her brother witness target practice on the beach by some security forces. The sound mix in the sequence in which Eri tends to the demented soldiers from World War II seems to me to include, amid Toru Takemitsu's menacing music, some of Hitler's famous raving. And of course, her own growing anxiety over an oncoming war culminates in 2 images of light, a searing burst of atomic light and an ominous-looking sun that remind us that her scars were caused in the bombing of Nagasaki, or so the film suggests. Tejigahara's love of art, in particular Nihonga from Japan and surrealism from the West, is evident throughout his films, as indicated by the several paintings in the face of another, in the apartment, the boss's office, and the clinic. He was steeped in Western art, so I think it's safe to assume that at least some of his striking compositions are derived from paintings. The abandoned ghost town in Pitfall, with its serrated shadows, seems a Japanified version of one of the deserted piazzas in the paintings of Giorgio de Chirico, a precursor of surrealism. Art historian Dory Ashton has compared the close-ups of sand in Woman in the Dunes to Juan Miró's blade-by-blade close-ups of grass in his paintings. In Face of Another, the glass installations in the psychiatrist's clinic were obviously influenced by Marcel Duchamp, whose work was important in Japanese art circles since the 30s. And the bizarre transformation of Erie's brother by a nuclear burst of light into an impaled hanging animal carcass also very much recalls for me the right-hand panel in Francis Bacon's triptych, Three Studies for a Crucifixion, in which Christ's body is transformed into a flayed animal carcass, as well as Chaim Soutin's still shocking 1925 painting, Carcass of Beef. The door in the psychiatrist's clinic opening to reveal woman's hair flowing in water like black seaweed recalls any number of surrealist paintings, hair being one of the most fetishized of body parts. But it also inserts imagery from the secondary story, that of Erie and her brother, into the main narrative. She, being connected with both water imagery and with the hair that hides her scars, helps her maintain her own mask to the world. I'm not sure whether that sudden image of the woman on a bed flying through a back-projected city derives from Frida Kahlo's 1932 painting The Flying Bed, because that image is a fairly common fixture in dreams and fairy tales. But I would hazard a guess that the sack-like homogenizing masks of the masses who spill onto the street near the end of The Face of Another were inspired by Magritte's famous painting The Lovers, or perhaps the death masks that so influenced surrealists such as Max Ernst. The motif of masks, introduced in Pitfall and carried into Woman in the Dunes, gets its fullest expression in The Face of Another. Obviously, Okayama presents a mask to the world, first his bandaged head, so reminiscent of the Invisible Man, and then his new manufactured face. But I think Tejigahara and Kobo Abe extend the idea of masks to something more metaphysical, more universal in the film, whereby all social relations are a form of masquerade, a dissembling of appearance of which some, like the Doctor, are aware, but most are not. One thinks of Ahab's reference to the visible world as pasteboard masks in Moby Dick, underneath which lies the void, or to the title of Ian Baruma's celebrated study of Japanese culture and its icons, Behind the Mask. In this generalizing image of humanity not so much wearing as being masks, Tejigahara asserts his pessimistic notion of the ubiquity of disguise and the false or distorted nature of social relations that inevitably results. In the psychiatrist's extreme formulation, which he asserts in the München Beer Hall, the widespread use of masks would lead to a complete crumbling of morality and meaning. I've already mentioned that I think Pitfall and The Face of Another share many characteristics, as vastly different as the two films are in tone and style. In concluding this analysis, I must broach a fault they also share, a double-stranded narrative that doesn't always work. And certainly I think its attempt to incorporate both the story of the itinerant miner, his little son, and the assassin, with the story of the unions, does not always coalesce successfully. The double story of The Face of Another is infinitely more daring and more disjunctive than it is in Pitfall. I really admire the boldness with which Tejigahara and Abe turn what is merely a slim coda in the novel into a substantial second story, and the way they introduce it with a startling lack of segue or signal. The image and the narrative suddenly, literally wash or melt into another. But the film's counterpoint between the two stories of scarred individuals, each overwhelmed by a different kind of existential anxiety, can seem both arbitrary and forced, especially in the last half hour of the film, where Tejigahara, through compression and cross-cutting, makes the parallels between the two stories, two lovemaking scenes, two deaths, more insistent than it was earlier in the film, Still, my fondness for these two films, Pitfall in the Face of Another, flawed as they are, probably exceeds that for Woman in the Dunes. They remain for me amongst the most underrated works of 60s Japanese cinema, and I hope they finally receive their due.